Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my rather belated Friday reads for May 8th, 2020. I'm filming in the evening on Friday because I just got my gas back. Those of you who watched my last Friday video might know that my condominium found a leak over the restaurant we share the building with, and it turned into this huge thing where they found all these mini leaks in all of the units, and they had to come in and fix them, and it took a lot of time of like finding out what you needed to fix them and coming back in to fix them. And there's so many units because of course I live in a high-rise, and it took days and days and days, and then they had to pass the the building test before they'd even allow us to turn the gas back on, and it finally is starting to happen. I'm pretty sure some people in my building don't have gas yet, but I do, and I just got out of the shower. So I just wanted to preen here in my nightgown because, hey, it's, it's nighttime. I don't know if I'd want to get on a brand new thing of clothes for a couple hours, but anyway, I'm just rambling and so happy. It's kind of crazy what being deprived something can do. It reminds me of a fable that I always think about all the time, about a Jewish fable about a man who feels cramped in his house, and the rabbi's advice is to keep on slowly filling his house with things and then taking them out, and by the time he's back to his first situation, he's thrilled. And so that's kind of how I feel. Like, coronavirus and the quarantining, it's pretty awful, but at least I have hot water and can cook food. Anyway, so moving on. I wanted to hopefully make the rest of this pretty short. This is my first Friday Reads of May, and usually what I do at the beginning of the month, or my first Friday Reads of the month, is just ignore the last month entirely. I won't talk about any of the books that I had going on in April because I already have posted my monthly literary newsletter. In my literary newsletter, I have snippets of my Goodreads reviews for all the books I've read that month. I have a book meme and a book pick and all sorts of other goodies. And so you can check that out below. Anywho, the book I finished this week is Beloved by Toni Morrison, which I read on ebook from my library. Anywho, I am reading this in part for Toni Morrison 2020, started by Hannah at Hannah's Books, although the Voxer kind of got off schedule because of the pandemic, which is kind of a shame, because I would love to be able to talk with people about this book, but I figured I wanted to keep going on with the schedule because I have so much to read already in the future. So this is the 5th book that Toni Morrison published, and ergo I read it in May when it came from the library. And I guess I have mixed feelings because I know this is her most popular book. I think it's her most famous popular book, and it felt a little bit like a departure for me in terms of the style. Like, I'm so used to Morrison's writing being filled with dialogue and how that makes the character stand out. But this is much more narrative heavy, like, paragraphs that go on for pages at a time. It can be really difficult to get your bearings, and Morrison also always went a little bit into sort of symbolism and magical realism, well, magical realism especially, but this one really took the cake. This is her historical novel. The other 4 I've read, I think, took place in contemporary times as she wrote them, more or less, but this one takes place predominantly right after the Civil War. And I believe Morrison got the idea for this story when she was working at a publishing house and came across a story of a real woman who was a fugitive slave, and rather than have her children taken back into slavery, she tried to kill them all, and I believe killed one of her children. And so Morrison went ahead and fleshed out this character's story. A whole lot. There's a whole lot of backstory and front story in this. Going back and forth, we get the protagonist Sethi and how she grew up and the place she was taken to as a 14-year-old, because she grew up on one type of plantation and then lived the rest of her sort of teen years and young adult life on another one, where she actually was able to marry one of the men who was a field hand who worked for the plantation, and they had children together. And she ended up wanting to run away, particularly when the old master died and his brother-in-law, or his brother, came in, I guess, and he was a much less empathetic person, if you can call it that. I think one of the things Morrison wanted to do was show different types of slaveholders, not to really let any of them off the hook, but just to show the complexity of it. I mean, the Garner man, he was the first plantation owner who owned Sethi when she was a young adult. He prided himself on saying that his slaves were men and not calling them boys, and like it was like a thing of sort of machismo for him. But you know, it all just comes down to himself and his selfishness and owning humans, so you know, you can't really let him off the hook for that. And there's all sorts of other characters as well in backstory. It feels like a lot of what I could say could be spoilers, because the narrative goes back and forth from the present day to the past. And in the present day, one of the other field hands from the Garner Plantation Sweet Home comes to where Sethi is living with her surviving children in Cincinnati, or near Cincinnati. And they're sort of getting reacquainted, and he ultimately hears the story about how when the Garner brother and family came to drag her back, that's when she killed one of her daughters and attempted to kill her sons as well, because she didn't want them to be forced back into slavery. And it's this thing that everyone around her, including you know, the black community around her, has very much ostracized her for ever since. And she was lucky not to get hanged even, but was basically helped along and to be, I guess, considered insane and let off the hook ultimately. And then, you know, slavery ended. Although, of course, Morrison lets us know through the backstories after the Civil War that that doesn't necessarily mean that life is much better for people, particularly for Paul D., the field hand, who was sort of living around as a vagrant, and he'd also had some really horrible things in his past, you know, forced upon him because of his slave status. And then he saw, you know, horrible stuff that happened to the freed black folk after the war that the South was doing sort of in revenge. So yeah, I guess I haven't gotten to the huge crux of the story, which is that this family of Sethi and her surviving daughter, because her two sons ran off to fight in the war, and Paul D., are visited by this stranger, this young woman a little older than her surviving daughter, Denver. This woman calls herself Beloved, which is the inscription on her dead daughter's tombstone, and it becomes kind of apparent that this this living woman could be Beloved, her daughter, her dead daughter, and in fact she had been haunting the house as a haint beforehand until Paul D. Drove her out, and then she maybe came back as this living figure, as it were. And it certainly plays into the relationship that Beloved has with the other family members, dealing with all of that trauma about what happened between them. But I don't think Morrison ever truly means to say, this is definitely the girl come back. She's more of a manifestation of all the trauma of black people and of what slavery did to them. So she's never quite 100% this one character. She's sort of a stand-in for all of the trauma, or a lot of the trauma, and it's just, it's obviously a moving and exhausting and depressing story about this horrible pain that this happened to these people, and Morrison definitely made them come alive, but not in the way that I was used to, with all the strong dialogue and everything in the present tense, and you know, and you really have to work even harder to understand what's going on sometimes, and to get yourself invested in the story, because I think there's probably a reason that the past and the present are melding together so much, because that's what trauma does to people. And there's just so much more in this story, so much really amazing, beautiful, haunting writing, and the way that Morrison gave voice to these tragic people and to the tragedy of slavery in her own unique way. Man, I'd love to talk to people about it. I hope we could talk about it on the Voxer. I'm sure I could find other commentary elsewhere. I do need to sit down and think of a good Goodreads review for this, but that's where I am with Beloved right now. Next, I started a book that I think I'll drop in and out of throughout the month because it's short stories. This is Carrie Her Home by Caroline Bock, which won for the fiction prize a couple of years ago for the Washington Writers Publishing House, a local to me publishing house. And I picked this up last year at the Gaithersburg Book Festival, which is going on this year in virtual form, so I'm excited for that. But anyway, I wanted to pick up some short stories because I'm trying to read through my shelves a little bit, and because May is American Short Story Month, and it's also Jewish American Heritage Month. And these auto stories are about Caroline Bock and her Jewish-Italian family, which is somewhat similar to my Jewish-Italian family. We actually gabbed a lot about that last year. So this is a little different for me. The auto fiction, also the flash fiction, these are some really short stories in here, so it'll be easier to dip in and out of, and I'm just curious to get my perspective on what I think of this sort of fiction. I'm just a little bit into it right now, but I'll check back with what I think as I go along. And finally, loaded right up here on audiobook is on Libby is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram x Kendi. This is, I believe, a book of essays, a book of philosophy of a sort, where Kendi looks at his own life and the broader world to try to understand how the ideas of racism are so pervasive in society and how to move past them. That's the general gist I get from this. I don't know much more, and I don't want to tell you much more because I am reading this book for the BookTube Prize quarterfinals. The BookTube Prize is an annual award where we whittle down the best in literary fiction and nonfiction throughout the year, and I am judging for nonfiction Group C. We have until the end of this month to finish the books in our group and rank them according to what we think of them. So until then, I will not talk in detail about this book again, but I will leave a link to the BookTube Prize down below. So that about covers it for me. I think I've covered all I want to say. Mostly right now, I want to think about cooking more food, or I don't know, washing my hands with some warm water. Ooh. And luxuriating in the fact that hopefully no strange men from the gas company will be tromping in and out of my home at all hours again, at least for the time being. I know that me and my cat Missy will be happy to have our space back, although I'm certainly very grateful to all the work they put into this. And I'm kind of worried about my condo fee next year, but we'll get to that when we get to that. In the meantime, I hope you all have great weekends, such as they are, planned in reading and other activities. And thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.